Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
In 1905, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad arrived in Las Vegas, which connected the city with the Pacific and the country's main railroad networks. This was basically the birth of what is now a famous city worldwide. In the same year, a team could be born from the death of another, and it all revolved around a college called the University of Detroit.
Welcome to the Football History Dude podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time as we step off the DeLorean, the date is September 23rd, 1934, and we are in Old University of Detroit Stadium to watch the newly formed Detroit Lions take on the vaunted New York Giants. This is the first ever game for the Detroit Lions, facing off against the last year's Eastern Division champs, almost the NFL champs. They lost to the Bears that year, but we are the New York Giants that we're facing off against. The 1930s version of David and Goliath, perhaps, because we're bringing in the Detroit Lions, their first ever year in 1934, against the New York Giants, the monsters of the East. But just like the giant in the story, the Lions did defeat the Giants 9-0. So this first ever NFL game for a Detroit team was a victory. Well, I mean, hold your horses here, because that wasn't necessarily the case. It wasn't the first ever Detroit team that played an NFL game. It wasn't even the second. I mean, it was further on. So let's go ahead and take it back a step. Let's go back to 1896, because we got to talk about the University of Detroit still. Now that's where the stadium was. That's where that game played, the Lions. Oh wait, they were also the Portsmouth Spartans, if you'd recall from earlier. But it doesn't matter, because that's still not the first Detroit team to be in the NFL. According to the University of Detroit Mercy's website, the first football season for the college was on 1896. So, maybe we're talking about a little bit of a grassroots kind of thing from 1896 for the Detroit Lions. But that was not the case. It was not the Detroit Lions. We're still talking about the University of Detroit. They became prestigious in the area pretty quickly, because in 1898, they were coached by Professor Patrick J. Burke. And what the site said, they owned the pretentious title of champions of Detroit and the vicinity. So in 1896, 1898, they got their football team underway pretty quickly. But what does this have to do with the NFL? This is the Football History Dude podcast about the history of the NFL and how it was born, and we're talking about all the original teams of 1920. Well, that's because in 1905, a dude by the name of Billy Marshall, halfback at the University of Detroit, he's all like, hey, I heard we ain't having a football team this year. Well, I ain't down with that. So he started his own team, basically the University of Detroit players. They called themselves the Detroit Heralds, and they started to play football. Now, it was not professional football yet, because they were just playing for fun, some local sports teams and such. But speaking of local sports teams, 1905, now that is a milestone year for the city of Detroit. But we're talking about baseball. And if you don't know what I'm saying, this is because 1905, this is the year that legendary baseball player for the Detroit Tigers, Ty Cobb, started his career. But a year before that, he was cut by the Augusta Tourists. then picked up by a semi-pro team in Anniston, Alabama. His father originally didn't even think that he should be playing baseball. Like, hey, kind of like a waste of your time, son. But even though he thought it was a waste of time, when Ty Cobb called his dad, after this whole getting cut and going to play for Alabama team and such, his dad told him this: "Go for it. And I want to tell you another thing. Don't come home a failure." Well, we all know, ultimately, he did not come home a failure because he was one of the greatest baseball players to ever play the game. And his debut in Detroit would be August 30th, 1905. Well, he didn't have a good rookie season. I mean, it was okay, I guess, but it wasn't all that great. And you know why it wasn't all that great? Well, man, this guy had a lot of baggage to unpack. August 8th, 22 days before his debut, Ty Cobb's mother shot and killed his father at night, claiming that she thought he was a burglar. This trial would go on for quite some time. She didn't get acquitted in a trial until March of 1906. So talk about a lot going on at the time for Ty Cobb. And a lot going on for the time of the city of Detroit. Football was there, but professional football was not a thing. Professional football, spawning from the University of Detroit, 1905, would someday become something. But at the time, it was the Detroit Tigers. And Ty Cobb, he was the start of it. Well, he wasn't the start of the Detroit Tigers, but he started his career the same year that the University of Detroit players would start something called the Detroit Heralds, later on becoming the first true professional football team. Well, the most successful professional football team, we'll call it, in the area, ultimately becoming an inaugural team of the NFL. But this is something that Ty Cobb had to deal with. His mother killing his father. Just like the city would have to deal with many other struggles during the era of the time of trying to create what would become the National Football League. In his autobiography, Ty Cobb said this: "In my grief, it didn't matter much. I only thought, Father won't know it." As in, his father would never know that he ultimately met his goal of becoming a professional baseball player. And then later on, he was a Hall of Fame baseball player, one of the greats. But goes the story of Detroit football, professional football. 1905 is the start of something. Not thought of anymore because it's just some random team that Detroit Heralds starting for fun because of University of Detroit. They decided not to have a team that year. But Billy Marshall, he kind of the sort of the architect of professional football in Detroit, have you? Because he would be considered the owner and coach all the way through the first season of the NFL. And again, they were amateurs back in 1905, but they did, according to many sources, drop the status of amateur in 1911. There was an article in the Detroit Free Press on December 4th of 1911, kind of talking about how the Detroit Heralds won the city championship. And here's a quote from that article describing the times. "The football championship banner, as well as the baseball pennant, shall float over Mack Park until another season rolls around and some organizations of sufficient strength are assembled to wrest them from the grasp of the representatives of the Mack Avenue Stadium." End quote. So there you go. Baseball, football, Mack Avenue. We have the pennant. We have the title, at least for the local city and all that kind of thing. But that's the beginning of something as far as professional football goes for them. Later in 1913, they were recognized as the first independent football team in America to wear numbers on their jerseys to publicize the players to make the game more fan-friendly. That's according to the NFL's original team page, which I'll go ahead and leave a link to that in the show notes for you. By the way, you can get to the show notes through your podcast player choice or by heading to thefootballhistorydude.com. While you're at it, I'd also ask that you please subscribe for free to this show by mashing that little subscribe button in your podcast player choice. That way you get the freshest, hottest out the press episodes each and every week. But back to football. Years did pass and the Detroit Heralds seemed to have a pretty good team by all accounts in the city. They played teams also from the Ohio League. I mean, it's close enough to Ohio, but don't tell that to the residents of Michigan. They ain't going to be down with that. But speaking of Ohio, the Columbus Panhandles. Talked about these guys before, the famous Nesser brothers. There's a book from Chris Willis entitled The Man Who Built the National Football League, Joe Carr. He talks about first 2 games that they had scored 18 touchdowns, that is the Columbus Panhandles, and they won those 2 games 123-0. But now they were about to jump to a whole new level because they're going to face the Detroit Heralds. And from the book, here's that quote. On October 14th, the Ohio State Journal wrote, Detroit critics contend that the Panhandles are better than the Heralds, and a lot of Columbus people who are in Detroit are anxious to see the two 11s clash. Football has gained a big foothold in Detroit, and Sunday's game is booked as one of the big attractions of the season. The entire Panhandle squad will make the trip. All members are in great condition. While in Detroit, the team will be quartered at the Cadillac Hotel. Come on, man. Publicizing the team hotel location? What's the deal here? But, again, professional football. Not as big. It's not like you're going to have thousands of raving fans in the area trying to break down the doors and such to get some autographs. It was just another game. In 1917, saw an article where they had an 8-2 record. Only 2 losses were to the Canton Bulldogs, the champs of the Ohio League that year, and also a military team from Battle Creek, Michigan. I mean, the Bulldogs, they had the great Jim Thorpe, so that makes sense. Don't really know a whole lot about this Battle Creek military team, though. That World War I comes around, the Great Flu pandemic caused many teams to shut down. Apparently, the Detroit Heralds, they kept going. It was mostly playing local teams and, because they were dealing with restrictions of traveling and rationing and all sorts of deals, but they kept at least playing. And that's like some of these other teams, many of these other teams, as far as professional goes, the ones that could at least keep alive at least a little bit are going to make it out at the end. World War I ends. Germany finally surrenders on November 11th, 1918. Then the Treaty of Versailles back in June 28th of 1919 marks the official end. In France, we have World War I done, in the books. Let's not deal with this crap anymore. I mean, we wish the Great War was the end, but it would end up being later. We have to deal with another one, and then it's time to get back to some normalcy. At least some sort of normalcy for the country and for the world. So let's get back to professional football. The following year, September 17th, 1920, the date we keep talking about, Ralph Hayes Hupmobile Auto Showroom. We're going to have a bunch of people come together to create what would ultimately become the National Football League. But the Detroit Heralds were not there. So why are we talking about them as an original team? Well, there were 4 teams that didn't show up, but ultimately would, what the league says, started or, would show up before the start of the season, and they're going to be on the team, and they're going to show up for the league, that kind of thing. The Detroit Heralds were one of them. The other 3 teams were the Chicago Tigers, the Buffalo All-Americans, and the Columbus Panhandles. So the first game for the Heralds in the 1920 season, according to Pro Football Reference, was against the Cleveland Panthers. They played them at home, and they beat them 40-14. But they were not an APFA team, that is NFL. So the first game against the NFL team, they would travel to Chicago to face the Chicago Tigers. They would lose 12-0, but it was in front of 5,000 fans, so at least, according to some sources there, we had some success. We got some people showing up to play and watch them and such. Find out a couple weeks ago, though, that the Tigers, they didn't last too long there in Chicago the first year. They got the whole mysterious, lose and you're out of this stadium, you're out of the game, you're out of the city kind of game. But we found out from Joe Ziemba that wasn't probably necessarily the truth. However, the first game for Detroit City against an NFL team, so what we can consider the first official NFL game in Detroit, was against those dang Nesser brothers again, the Columbus Panhandles. They would travel back to Detroit. They would end up beating the Panhandles 6-0. But that would be the last victory that they would have for the rest of the year. I mean, they had some ties and other things like that, but it was the last time they had a W. An article, though, from Vintage Detroit website mentioned how the league kind of took a backseat at the beginning. NFL, you don't really matter a whole lot because from the article, they said that emblematic of the league's low status was the fact that the Heralds' tussle with their traditional rival was played at Mack Park because Frank Navin had reserved his ballpark for an amateur hurling match. And a hurling match? Wait, the NFL, you're talking about right now, I guess when the episode releases, 2020, we have the NFL, the biggest professional sports league in the country, is being pushed aside for hurling. Now, I know a lot of bros be hurling after the games if they've been drinking too much, but hurling, what the heck is hurling? So I had to look it up. It's a very old game that from the website called Experience Gaelic Games called it this. It is over 3,000 years old, and it is said to be the world's fastest field game, combining skills from lacrosse, field hockey, and baseball in a hard-hitting, highly paced game set in the ancient myths of Irish history. Step back here, this is a long, old-timer game. It's 3,000 years old. But still, nowadays, hurling, that's like what you watch on ESPN 5742, something like that. But they were able to push aside the NFL. Goes to show you how different it is today than it was back in 1920 when the league started. And speaking of 1920, the Detroit Heralds would end the year with 2 wins, 3 losses, and 3 ties. Then in 1921, they didn't have a whole lot of success either. They would rebrand themselves as the Detroit Tigers and change their colors to black and orange, which I guess makes a little bit of sense because nowadays it's like they're the Detroit Lions and they're blue. And it's like, hey, Lions ain't blue except for if you're a Lions fan, you always be blue. And ultimately, it was because they took on the baseball moniker of the time. It was the Detroit Tigers, as they are now. As many football teams did, they would just say, whoever the major league team is, let's just call our team after them because they were not too creative and baseball was supreme. Back in the day, that was. So 1921 comes and goes. They really don't have a successful year. They have a combined record of 1 win, 5 losses, and a tie. And then they're folded. There would not be a team in Detroit until 1925 when the Detroit Panthers showed up and they would post an 8-2-2 record. But still, the Detroit Heralds were one of the original NFL teams. But maybe the biggest name that came from the team was Norb Saxteter. I found an article in the Sports Illustrated Talk of Fame network by Rick Gosselin. It was called one of those, they have a whole bunch of state your case kind of articles for mostly just who should be in the Hall of Fame kind of thing. He had these different Ohioans, Kevin O'Donnell and Doug Spatz, pour over newspaper clippings to figure out some stats. And remember, this is early 1900s, so it's basically only W's and losses. And the box scores didn't really exist back then, so it was kind of difficult to get it. However, they called Saxteter the Barry Sanders of his generation, both in stature and style. He stood only 5 foot 9 inches and 172 pounds and took very few direct hits from tacklers because of a unique spin move. Well, that's you're talking to Detroit Barry Sanders fan myself, and that's a tall order. But the article figured that he scored over 50 touchdowns, and 15 of them were from at least 50 or more yards. That's pretty good. They also mentioned that he scored 42 points on 7 touchdowns in a 1916 game against the Cincinnati Northerners. Not the NFL now at the time, of course, or the APFA even yet, but it would be better than that Ernie Nevers 40-point game, which is currently the NFL record. So that would be even better. Saxteter would have the record. Of course, I haven't seen the other potential records that would have been even before that. But still, he would currently, at least from the information I have now, have an NFL record if they would have started the NFL a couple years earlier. But going back to the story about Ty Cobb, at the time, Detroit papers called Saxteter the Ty Cobb of football. Now, that is a pretty tall order, and that's a pretty big claim. But if that's really what they thought of him during those days, I'd say then he must have been a pretty big-time player. And even though he was a professional football player, he was not a professional football player during the American Professional Football Association or the National Football League. But to Gosselin, he doesn't care, because he believes that Norb Saxteter belongs in the Professional Football Hall of Fame. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Football History Dude podcast and were able to gain some gridiron knowledge nuggets about how professional football started in the city of Detroit. If you enjoyed the show, I ask that you please share it with another football geek such as yourself by sending them to thefootballhistorydude.com. Now next week, we're going to go ahead and stick around with the original NFL teams as we venture into a new decade in the current timeline. But for now, dudes, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.